The message came through at 3:47 Zulu, text only, no voice. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb crouched behind a shattered concrete barrier in the Helmand district, dust caking his lips, blood seeping through the makeshift tourniquet on his left thigh. His rifle had jammed 2 magazines ago. The Taliban had them boxed in on 3 sides, mortar fire walking closer every 90 seconds. He typed with shaking hands into the encrypted comm device. "I won't make it out." No drama, no plea. Just arithmetic. 6 men left from his 12-man reconnaissance unit, ammunition down to 40 rounds total, and the nearest quick reaction force was 70 minutes away by ground. The math didn't work. Around him, the others had stopped returning fire, saving bullets for the final rush they all knew was coming. Webb hit send and closed his eyes, listening to the wind-carry voices in Pashto across the valley floor, listening to the metallic click of weapons being readied just beyond the wall. Then the sky changed. Not the sound first, but the feeling. A pressure shift that made Webb's ears pop, a shadow that moved wrong against the pre-dawn darkness. He looked up and saw something that made no sense. An A-10 Thunderbolt coming in at what looked like 50 feet, so low he could see panel rivets, nose pointed at the ridgeline where the mortar teams were dug in. But the aircraft was wrong. The entire vertical stabilizer was gone, just a ragged stump where the tail should be, and the right engine housing showed scorched metal and missing cowling panels. It shouldn't have been flying. It definitely shouldn't have been flying straight. The GAU-8 Avenger opened up with that distinctive roar that sounds like the universe tearing in half. 30-millimeter rounds walked across the ridgeline in a perfect line, each impact visible as a brief sun, and the mortar fire stopped. Just stopped. The A-10 pulled up impossibly steep for something missing a tail, rolled inverted for reasons Webb couldn't fathom, and came back around for a second pass. This time rockets, ripple-fired from the remaining undamaged pods. The Taliban positions on the eastern approach disintegrated. Webb's radio crackled. A woman's voice, calm as someone ordering coffee. "Ground unit vicinity grid November Victor 7341, this is Hawkeye 2-1. Understand you're having a rough morning. Let's fix that." The A-10 came around again, still impossibly low, still missing its tail, and Webb watched tracer fire from the northern position arc up toward it. The aircraft didn't evade, didn't climb. It flew straight through the fire and put a burst exactly where those tracers originated. Silence followed, complete ringing silence. "Hawkeye 2-1, Webb transmitted, voice hoarse. "You're flying without a tail." Brief pause. "I'm aware. Seemed rude to mention it. How's your situation?" Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Ashford stood in the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram, staring at the data link display like it might suddenly start making sense. It didn't. The IFF transponder showed Hawkeye 2-1's A-10 at grid November Victor 7-3, providing close air support to a pinned reconnaissance unit. Standard enough. What wasn't standard was the damage assessment telemetry the aircraft was somehow still transmitting. Hydraulic pressure in the redundant flight control systems showed amber across the board. The auxiliary power unit was offline. Engine number 2 was operating at 63% capacity with oil temperature in the red. And according to every sensor that monitored the empennage, the vertical stabilizer had catastrophic structural failure and was no longer attached to the aircraft. "Sir," the air operations controller said quietly, "that's impossible." "I can read the display, Captain." Ashford pulled up the pilot's file with 2 keystrokes. Major Alina Voronova, 9 years flying the A-10, 247 combat missions, call sign Hawkeye, earned during her first deployment when she'd identified a high-value target from 18,000 feet in a sandstorm using nothing but the Maverick missile's infrared seeker, and what she later described as paying attention. The file included 3 letters of reprimand for unauthorized low-altitude flight profiles, 2 letters of commendation for lives saved by those same flight profiles, and 1 congressional inquiry that had gone nowhere because the 16 soldiers she'd pulled out of a kill zone had testified that she'd flown through a dust storm at what they estimated was negative altitude. Ashford keyed the command net. Hawkeye 2-1, Bagram actual. Immediate RTB, do not continue engagement. The response took 6 seconds, which in radio communication was roughly equivalent to someone taking a long sip of coffee before answering. Bagram actual, Hawkeye 2-1. Ground unit still taking effective fire from western approach. Will RTB after eliminating threat. Hawkeye, your aircraft is not flight capable. That's an order, not a suggestion. Another pause. Respectfully, sir, aircraft seems to disagree with that assessment. Still flying. Western threat in 15 seconds. Ashford watched the data link as the A-10 icon made another attack run, this time from an angle that put the damaged aircraft between the enemy position and the friendly unit. Textbook human shield maneuver, except the human in question was flying a half-destroyed jet at speeds that barely kept it aloft. The weapons release indicator flashed. The western position on the tactical map went dark. Ground unit reports all threats neutralized, the controller said. Hawkeye 2-1 is egressing the area. Course set for, sir, she's not heading for Bagram. She's heading for Kandahar. Kandahar's 40 minutes farther with that damage profile. Yes, sir, but Kandahar has the longer runway and better emergency response capability. The captain looked up from his console. She knows she's going to crash. She's trying to crash somewhere that won't kill anyone else. Staff Sergeant Webb watched the A-10 disappear into the lightening eastern sky, trailing smoke from the damaged engine. His men were already packing up, moving to the extraction point now that the area was secure. But Webb stood there for another moment, watching that smoke trail fade, thinking about the calm voice that had asked how his situation was while flying an aircraft that should have already killed her. Who was that? Private First Class Torres asked, slinging his rifle. Someone who types better reports than she flies safe, Webb said, but he was smiling when he said it. Major Elena Voronova had approximately 38 minutes of flight time remaining before the combination of hydraulic failure, fuel exhaustion, and structural instability would make controlled flight impossible. She knew this because she'd done the math 3 times, and all 3 times the numbers had been terrible. The A-10 was shaking now, a vibration that started in the stick and worked its way through the airframe metal fatigue announcing itself in real time. Without the vertical stabilizer, directional control was accomplished entirely through differential thrust and the rudimentary surfaces that remained, which meant every control input was an ongoing negotiation with physics. She'd lost the tail 17 minutes ago, surface-to-air missile proximity fuse, the blast close enough to peel open the empennage like a can of soup. The aircraft had yawed hard right, nose dropping, altitude bleeding off in chunks. Elena had fed and left aileron, pushed the throttles to max, and let the A-10 do what it did best, refuse to quit. The airplane had stabilized at 240 knots and 400 feet above ground level, and Elena had made a choice. She could limp back to Bagram immediately, maybe make it, maybe not, or she could answer the emergency call from the ground unit that was 30 seconds from being overrun. The choice had been easy. Math was math, but 6 men dying while she flew overhead to save herself wasn't math she could live with. Now she had 38 minutes, no tail, and Kandahar Airfield's runway somewhere ahead in the morning haze. The radio chatter had gone quiet after Bagram's order to RTB. They were watching her telemetry, doing their own math, probably scrambling the crash crews. Elena checked fuel one more time. 1,100 pounds remaining, burn rate elevated due to the damaged engine working overtime. She adjusted course 2 degrees north, compensating for the crosswind that wanted to push her damaged aircraft sideways. Kandahar Tower, Hawkeye 2-1, 40 miles southeast, declaring emergency. Aircraft has sustained major structural damage, vertical stabilizer detached, requesting priority landing and full emergency response. The tower controller's voice came back immediately, professional but tight. Hawkeye 2-1, Kandahar Tower copies emergency. Winds 270 at 12, gusting 15. Runway 23 right is cleared, all traffic holding. Emergency equipment is rolling. Say souls on board and fuel remaining. One soul, approximately 1,000 pounds fuel. Brief pause. Hawkeye, confirm you're flying an A-10 with no tail and one person aboard. That's a firm. Aircraft is controllable but unstable. We'll need the full runway length and probably some of the overrun. Copy all. Hawkeye, we have you on radar. Fly heading 285, descend and maintain 3,000 feet. Captain Jennifer Park sat in Kandahar Tower, watching the radar return that represented Major Voronova's crippled. She'd been a controller for 6 years, talked down everything from helicopters with engine failures to transports with landing gear problems. But she'd never talked down an aircraft that was missing primary flight control surfaces. The morning shift supervisor appeared at her shoulder, retired Air Force colonel who'd stayed on as a civilian contractor. He studied the radar scope, then looked at Park. You have the aircraft. I'm going to clear the pattern and brief emergency response. Keep her talking, keep her calm, and if she starts to lose it, don't be afraid to be direct. She's a combat pilot. She can handle truth. Park keyed the mic. Hawkeye 2-1, Kandahar. Understand you engaged hostile forces after sustaining damage. Can you describe aircraft handling characteristics? Alina's voice came back steady. Sluggish roll response, constant right yaw tendency requiring left rudder and differential thrust. Pitch control degraded but functional. Speed envelope narrow. Needs to stay above 220 knots or stability decreases significantly. Maximum safe airspeed approximately 300 knots before structural concerns become critical. Copy. When you enter the pattern, recommend wide base leg to give yourself room for approach adjustments. Concur. Tower, be advised I may not be able to execute a go-around if the approach goes wrong. This is likely a one-attempt situation. Park felt her mouth go dry but kept her voice level. Understood, Hawkeye. We'll make the first one count. You're 28 miles out. Maintain present heading and altitude. From across the operations center, someone said quietly, she's the one they call Hawkeye. Flew through that dust storm at Sangin in 09. Saved an entire platoon. That was her. Yeah, they say she flies low because she wants to see what she's shooting at. Doesn't trust sensors alone. Park watched the radar blip crawl toward the airfield. 26 miles now. She pulled up the emergency response checklist, scanned procedures she'd memorized years ago but needed to see anyway. Behind her, phones were ringing as word spread. A-10 pilot attempting emergency landing with catastrophic damage. People would want to watch. People always wanted to watch. The A-10's instrument panel was a cascade of amber and red warning lights, so many that Alina had stopped paying attention to most of them. The master caution light had been on so long it had become part of the background, like tinnitus. What mattered was the airspeed indicator, the altimeter, the fuel gauge, and the view through the canopy. Everything else was commentary. She crossed the checkpoint that marked 20 miles from Kandahar, descended to 3,000 feet using careful back pressure on the stick, feeling the airframe protest every change in pitch. The sun was fully up now, burning off the haze, and she could see the airfield ahead, the long slash of runway 23 right cutting across the desert floor. It looked impossibly narrow from here, though she knew it was 12,000 feet long and wide enough to land a C-5. Perspective was everything. Kandahar Tower, Hawkeye 2-1 has the field in sight. Roger, Hawkeye, turn left heading 240, reduce speed to best approach speed. Alina began the turn, feeding in aileron slowly, using rudder pressure and thrust differential to keep the nose tracking. The aircraft wanted to roll through the turn and keep going. She countered with opposite aileron, adjusted throttles, felt sweat running down her spine despite the cold air at altitude. The turn took 20 seconds that felt like minutes. She rolled wings level on the new heading, checked the runway alignment. Perfect. Speed reduction was the dangerous part. She pulled the throttles back slightly, watching the airspeed bleed from 240 to 230, The vibration increased. At 225 knots, the aircraft began to wallow, the damaged aerodynamics making themselves known. She pushed the throttles forward slightly, stabilized at 230. That would be her approach speed. Faster than ideal, but ideal had left the conversation when the tail departed. Tower Hawkeye is established at 230 knots, configuring for landing. She reached for the landing gear handle, hesitated. Landing gear added drag, which meant she'd need more power to maintain speed, which meant less power available if she needed to arrest a sink rate on final approach. But landing without gear wasn't really an option, not with the aircraft this unstable. She pulled the handle. 3 green lights. At least something still worked. Hawkeye 2-1, gear down and locked. Cleared to land runway 23 right. Wind 280 at 14 gusting 18. The crosswind was going to be challenging. Alina adjusted her mental approach, planning to fly a crab angle into the wind until the last possible moment, then use whatever rudder authority she had left to align the fuselage with the runway centerline. Standard procedure, except nothing about this was standard. She descended through 1,500 feet, runway growing larger, details becoming visible. Emergency vehicles lining the taxiway, red lights flashing. A crowd gathered near the tower. Word had spread. They'd come to watch either a successful emergency landing or a spectacular crash. Alina didn't judge them for it. She'd have watched too. The approach continued, altitude decreasing, runway expanding to fill her windscreen. 1,000 feet, 800, 600. The aircraft was stable, barely a negotiated truce with aerodynamics that could dissolve any second. Her hands were light on the controls, making tiny adjustments, letting the A-10 fly itself as much as possible. 400 feet. The wind tried to push her left. She corrected. 200 feet. The runway threshold passed beneath her, concrete close enough to see individual cracks. She pulled the throttles to idle, felt the aircraft sink, added back pressure to arrest the descent. The main gear touched with a chirp, rolled for a second, and then the nose gear came down and the world became very loud and very violent. The A-10 immediately began to veer right, the damaged airframe's asymmetry asserting itself without thrust to counteract it. Alina stood on the left rudder pedal, using differential braking, but the aircraft was heavy and fast and not interested in cooperation. The runway centerline disappeared beneath her left wing. She was drifting toward the right edge of the pavement, toward the dirt and sand that would catch the landing gear and flip the aircraft. She released the right brake completely, applied maximum left brake, felt the left main gear tire protest with a scream of tortured rubber. The aircraft started to rotate, nose swinging left, but now she was decelerating sideways at 120 knots on one wheel. If the gear collapsed, she'd cartwheel. If she overcorrected, she'd spin. She modulated the brake, eased off, let the nose swing through center, applied both brakes evenly. The A-10 shuddered, decelerated hard, tracking left now. Alina corrected right, overcorrected, fishtailed back. 60 knots. 40. 20. The aircraft rolled to a stop 3,000 feet from the end of the runway, 10 feet right of centerline, nose pointed 15 degrees off heading. Alina sat in the cockpit for a moment, hands still on the controls, listening to the cooling engines tick and the warning horns blare. Through the canopy she could see the emergency vehicles approaching, lights strobing. She reached up, began the shutdown procedure. Master fuel switches off, battery off. The horns went silent. She popped the canopy, and the morning air rushed in, hot and smelling of jet fuel and burned rubber. Behind her, she heard someone cheering. She climbed out of the cockpit on legs that trembled slightly, dropped to the concrete and walked around the aircraft. The damage looked worse in daylight. The entire vertical stabilizer was gone, severed cleanly about 18 inches above the horizontal stabilizer. The right engine showed blast damage and carbon scoring. Multiple panels were missing, exposing the framework beneath. The left main gear tire was shredded, hanging in strips. The aircraft had flown 70 nautical miles in this condition, engaged enemy forces and landed successfully. Major Voronova, the fire chief approached, bunker gear and helmet making him look enormous. Hell of a piece of flying. Hell of an airplane, Alina said. She reached out, touched the scorched metal of the fuselage. She brought me home. Staff Sergeant Webb received the after-action report 3 days later, dry military language describing the engagement, the damage sustained by Hawkeye 2-1, the successful emergency landing. What it didn't describe was the feeling of watching that damaged make pass after pass, putting itself between his men and the enemy fire. What it didn't describe was the calm voice on the radio, talking about having a rough morning like the aircraft wasn't disintegrating around her. He wrote his own report, detailed account of the engagement from the ground perspective. He included every pass the A-10 had made, every weapon employed, every adjustment to the attack pattern that had kept his men alive. At the end, he added a paragraph that would never appear in any official document. The pilot of Hawkeye 2-1 demonstrated exceptional courage and tactical acumen. She sustained catastrophic damage, had every reason to disengage and save herself, and instead chose to complete the mission and ensure the safety of ground personnel. I am alive because she made that choice. My men are alive because she made that choice. Whatever happens next in her career, whatever decorations or commendations she receives or doesn't receive, I want it on record that we know what she did. 3 weeks later, Alina sat in a briefing room at Bagram while a board of officers reviewed the incident. The atmosphere was formal, careful, walking the line between investigating a successful mission and determining whether someone had violated regulations. The A-10 had been declared a total loss, salvaged for parts but never to fly again. Alina had been grounded pending the investigation, standard procedure, nothing personal. The board president, a brigadier general who'd flown F-16s in the First Gulf War, studied the damage photographs. Major Voronova, at what point did you determine the aircraft was no longer safe to fly? Sir, the aircraft was never safe to fly after the missile strike, but it was flyable. There's a difference. Walk me through your decision-making process after sustaining damage. Alina had prepared for this question, had known it was coming. I assessed the aircraft handling characteristics and determined I could maintain controlled flight. I received the emergency call from the ground unit at approximately the same time. Their situation was critical. Bagram had no other assets in position to respond. I made a tactical decision to engage the threat before returning to base. You were ordered to RTB immediately. Yes, sir. I complied with that order after neutralizing the immediate threat to the ground unit. The general leaned back in his chair. Major, did it occur to you that by continuing to engage with a severely damaged aircraft, you were risking not only your life but the aircraft itself? That's a $30 million weapons platform. Alina met his eyes. Sir, the aircraft was already unsalvageable. The damage to the empennage alone made it a write-off. What I could salvage was 6 lives. That math seemed straightforward. That's not your decision to make in the moment. With respect, sir, it's exactly my decision to make in the moment. I'm the pilot in command. I have responsibility for the aircraft and the mission. The mission includes supporting ground forces in contact. The room was silent for several seconds. The general exchanged glances with the other board members. Finally, he spoke. Major, this board finds that while your actions were not in strict compliance with the immediate RTB order, they were consistent with the broader mission parameters and resulted in successful preservation of friendly forces. Your tactical decision-making under extreme circumstances was sound. No disciplinary action is recommended. However, I would like to note for the record that this is the 3rd time you've appeared before a board for unauthorized flight profiles. Yes, sir. The fact that all 3 times resulted in successful missions doesn't mean the 4th time will. The regulations exist for reasons. I understand, sir. Do you? The general's expression was unreadable. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you keep finding yourself in situations where you have to choose between following orders and saving lives. That's not sustainable." Alina said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was right. The board adjourned. Alina walked out of the room and found Captain Marcus Webb waiting in the corridor, dress uniform, somehow looking exactly like the dust-covered sergeant she'd seen through her targeting pod 3 weeks ago. He stood when he saw her. "Major Voronova, I wasn't sure you'd remember me." "You're hard to forget, Captain. Last time I saw you, you were having a rough morning." She smiled slightly. "Congratulations on the promotion, by the way." "Thank you, ma'am. I wanted to tell you in person. My entire team is alive because of what you did. We know what it cost you." "It cost the Air Force an A-10. It didn't cost me anything." Webb shook his head. "With respect, ma'am, that's not true. It cost you whatever they just put you through in that room. It cost you the scrutiny and the investigation and the questions about your judgment. And you paid that cost without hesitation. I wanted you to know that we see it. We understand what you gave up." Alina felt something catch in her throat, pushed it down. "You would have done the same." "Maybe, but I wasn't in a position to do it. You were, and you did." He extended his hand. She shook it. "If you ever need anything, Major, you call me. Anytime, any reason. I owe you 6 lives, including my own." After he left, Alina stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the photographs on the wall. Previous squadrons, previous wars, previous pilots who'd made similar choices and lived or didn't. She wondered how many of them had stood in similar corridors, accepting similar thanks, wondering if the cost had been worth it. It had been worth it, she knew that, but knowing it didn't make the next part easier. Lieutenant Colonel Ashford found her in the squadron bar that evening, nursing a single beer and staring at the wall. He sat down without asking, ordered his own beer, waited until the bartender was out of earshot. "The board cleared you," he said. "I heard. You don't sound relieved." "I'm relieved 6 men aren't dead. The rest is paperwork." Ashford drank some beer, considered his next words carefully. "Alina, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you trying to get yourself killed?" She looked at him then, genuinely surprised. "What? No, why would you think that?" "Because in 9 years, you've accumulated more damage to aircraft and more close calls than pilots with twice your flight hours. You fly lower than anyone else. You stay on station longer than anyone else. You take risks that no one else would even consider. And every time, you have a good tactical reason for it. But I'm starting to wonder if the tactics are the reason or the excuse." Alina was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "When I was a kid, my grandfather used to tell me about flying helicopters in Vietnam. He talked about the missions where he'd come in under fire to extract wounded soldiers, how he'd keep the helicopter steady while they loaded casualties, how he'd count seconds and pray the rotors didn't take a hit. He said the hard part wasn't the fear. The hard part was landing safely afterward and knowing you'd get up the next day and do it again. The hard part was living with the memory of the ones you couldn't save. And he told me that the only way he survived 20 years of flying was by deciding that every mission was worth whatever it cost. That if he started doing the math differently, started valuing his own life over the mission, he'd second-guess himself in the moment and get people killed. So he just decided that everyone else's life was more important than his own, and after that the decisions got easier." Ashford was silent. Alina continued, "I'm not trying to get myself killed, Raymond. I'm trying to live with myself afterward. There's a difference. Your grandfather survived 20 years. You understand that, right? Survived. He came home. He didn't fly until the aircraft disintegrated. He came home because he got lucky, and because his aircraft kept flying when they shouldn't have, just like mine did. Alina, you're one of the best pilots I've ever commanded, but the best pilot in the world is useless if they're dead. I need you to promise me you'll think about that." She met his eyes. "I think about it every time I strap in. And every time, I decide that the kid on the ground who's counting on me deserves the same consideration my grandfather's wounded soldiers deserved. I can't do this job any other way, Raymond. I wouldn't know how. Ashford finished his beer, set the glass down carefully. Then maybe you should think about whether you want to keep doing this job. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Alina didn't respond. After a moment, Ashford stood, put a hand on her shoulder briefly, and left. Alina sat alone in the bar, her beer getting warm, thinking about the A-10 sitting in pieces in a salvage yard somewhere. Thinking about the morning she'd typed a message